Welcome into the program for a project that I'm loosely calling the Soccer Card Collective. This is the pilot episode, episode 1. What I'm looking to do in this program project is to talk about soccer card collecting. Having been in the space for about 5 years now, as an almost exclusively soccer card collector, I've always been looking for more soccer card collecting contact to interact with. And starting in 2026, I figured I'd throw my hat in the ring of content creation and just in general, just starting conversations about soccer card collecting. At some point in the future, there may be guests on this, but we'll see how it evolves as I start doing more episodes. Starting out in the first episode, I wanted to get into some talk about the big picture of soccer card collecting, so that all those people who are soccer card curious, or all the way to people who are avid soccer card collectors already, just talking about how I view the big picture when it comes to deciding what to collect in soccer cards. You can follow, I guess, my own journey on my Instagram page, which is Mad City Collector. But I went through this process very early on in my soccer card collecting to figure out, what I wanted to collect and what, felt meaningful and worthy of my time, attention, and, money as far as dipping into the space. So, without further ado, start the conversation here. I guess when I dipped in to card collecting, when you start thinking about it, there are different eras you typically think of in whether it's any sport. Having grown up in the U.S., baseball cards were obviously a kind of starting port in my conceptual framework for cards. And when I got into soccer card collecting, I realized that there was some aspects that were very similar to my conceptual framework of baseball cards, but there were other things that were unique to soccer as I went to unpack everything that soccer card collecting provided. So generically, when you start talking about old cards, you use the term vintage. Soccer cards go all the way back to around the same time as baseball cards. When tobacco companies in the late 19th century started to try to promote their products to young people, despite your moral misgivings you may have for that practice. That's the advent of lots of card collecting, and certainly in the UK, especially, I've seen a lot of early soccer cards that really mirror what we saw in baseball. That and many of which have a following, particularly in the UK community. And then as far as vintage goes, that's the beginning, in that time. But it goes all the way, pretty much continuously, through the early 20th century. But much like baseball cards, there weren't, specific manufacturers that produced cards or for a larger market. And the thing that I noticed that was different also at this time, as far as baseball cards is that not only were cards starting to produce, but also stickers or cards, in some cases that were meant to be actually glued or stuck into albums that commemorated whether it was seasons, events, teams. There was a whole wide variety of reasons to produce the cards and stickers at that time. And generally speaking, in baseball or some of the more American products, that wasn't necessarily the culture. So that was a new concept that was introduced to me as I was doing my research in soccer card collecting. And fast forward, all of these old cards and stickers, were being produced into the middle of the 20th century, and you know, I really was like, how do I organize these in my head? Like, why would I want to collect these cards? Um, and really, when you talk about vintage cards, having not seen any of these people play, having not, seen most of the highlights of anyone who, played in the first half of the 20th century play, television, video was not a big part of sports during that time. So, I mean, really the only way for me to kind of conceptualize getting involved in any of these early stickers would have been, if I wanted to really, dig deep into the history of the sport. And watching YouTube videos was one way to figure out whether I would be interested in, going into these things. And there are certain collectors who are really deep into it. Al Dragella, otherwise known as El Ray Collection on Instagram, has a YouTube channel called Epic Cardboard. I dipped into a lot of his early content where he has a personal collection that I think he told me when I talked to him at the National this past year of like probably at least 50 players that he PCs from this early vintage era. And so I just, not having heard of most of these players prior to this collection, it was hard for me to really wrap my head around how I'd even go about kind of learning the history of them. And for me personally, it seemed a bridge too far to go into that. But if you're a big history person and want to know the history of a lot of these early players and events, I mean, this would be a great era to collect. And when you parse out this like early history, like what do you call these different eras? I think the general term that people have used in baseball collecting, which I've also heard in soccer collecting, a lot of people refer to this era as, or the early era as the pre-war vintage era. So that would be pre-World War II. I think it's a convenient terminology to use because it was such a large world event, but I don't know. Upon reflection, it doesn't really fit into kind of actually the structure of the sport and card production and collecting. It's more just convenient point in time to refer to rather than actually, I felt like something meaningful as far as what the soccer card space looked like. So I even in baseball, like what people refer to as pre-war, but it really, in baseball, it really almost seems to me like the turning point actually changed in the context of certain sets and cards being produced. And for baseball, it was really the 1952 Topps that kind of started a lineage and a legacy that shaped what cards looked like, for the next 40 or 50 years until kind of modern production started. And so in soccer, I tried to look for the same kind of turning points and everything. And so prior, in this early era, really the cards and stickers were all niche releases that were really only distributed in the country where they were produced. And that was really the hallmark of this early era of vintage cards. And that, if you're collecting, you're really, and part of, I think, the allure for a lot of collectors during this vintage era is you actually have to source and somehow get access to these cards that were produced in these individual countries, whether it was Europe, South America, those were the main continents where these were being produced. Soccer stickers weren't really being produced in the United States. Our soccer culture wasn't really big during that time. So really I mean, those are the places you have to source these, rare, stickers from. And as I was saying before, I mean, and one of the big challenges too, also sourcing them, is that, you know, many of these stickers were actually glued into albums. And, at the time, I mean, I don't think many of them even had much, value. So it's like, when kids collected them and they moved away, their parents had no incentive to keep them in a lot of cases. So they're just a lot of these stickers, even if they were printed in large numbers, how many have survived over time? And you really have to dig through, just collections, and it seems really hard to find. And so I think for a lot of people, that's really the allure of collecting this, as well as just learning the history of that era. Um, and then when I was digging through, so that, so there's, I don't have a lot of detailed knowledge personally about a lot of the different sets from this era. And I encourage you, if this sounds like a fun project for you, there is a vintage cards Discord that is popular amongst the vintage community, where people talk and learn about new cards and sets and talk about, what they like about different eras, different countries, different players, and things like that. So I would highly encourage you to, you can probably just Google it, the vintage soccer card Discord, and you'll learn more than I can, talk about in terms of vintage soccer cards. So as opposed to, I guess, after that kind of long, discussion, I saw, one of the big turning points I saw in the kind of the soccer card collecting space really begins with uh, Pele, which, he, for all intents and purposes, he's probably the first global superstar that was really recognized, or at least his name was recognized, or really started to be recognized across the world. And I think really that, um, you know, started partially because television, you know, started to really, allow people to actually see these players play. And the first year that any portion of the World Cup was, televised was 1954, and in reality, I mean, the World Cup had been, the first competed in 1930, and reading up on the history of the World Cup is fascinating, both for soccer and just global, intrigue. But 1954 was the first year that any sort of, television, for the World Cup was performed, and it wasn't until 1966 when it was, actually meaningfully distributed, on a wider, more worldwide scale. So, Pele really kind of, as the kind of almost like a cult, star, he was almost a mythological character because, he was playing his club football in Brazil. So a lot of the world had no access to seeing his live games. And a lot of times the only time the world stage got to glimpse him was at the World Cup. So that, for me, kind of started a new era, I guess, as far as intrigue and people wanting to have some sort of attachment to, a global icon. And so there was really kind of an explosion of kind of different, cards and stickers during that era to kind of commemorate this mythological talent that, was kind of gaining the popular consciousness. And so his first sticker, actually being produced in just a small niche set in Brazil in 1957. It was, as part of just like an album that people collected. I think part of it was a marketing tool for, uh, a company then. And to be honest, I don't know the exact history of kind of the exact marketing ploy that was being used at that time, but it was kind of, the album was produced as a marketing ploy. Very few of those stickers from that early 1957 album have been produced, and there are different variations based off of I just the actual set you're collecting, and then some of them were actually kind of these like points that you collected to get prizes and things like that, which is a popular theme with soccer cards, especially during the early era. And then when you go back to that time, there was when Brazil won the World Cup in 1958, there were a bunch of commemorative sets. One of the, this is the 1958 Pele Aquarella, which came from essentially a magazine that had perforated edges. This is one of his kind of early iconic images, commemorating that time. And it was really that 1958 World Cup where he scored a hat trick and a brace in the semifinal and finals, where his legend really started to grow. And you really saw the Aquarella release was out of Brazil, but you also saw the curiosity from other countries. And so, in Germany, this was around 1958, 1959. This was the Bremer Fachring set, which just produced, distributed in the Bremer region of Germany. It was a redemption system based off of, coffee. So, during the excitement of the World Cup, here's another variation. This was really kind of, trying to capture that excitement that people had from the 1958 World Cup in Sweden. There were other, Brazilian sticker releases in that early, like Pele kind of rookie, kind of rookie adjacent era. Some people refer to these 1958 cards as rookie cards, despite, the existence of the 1957s. The whole concept of rookie in soccer is just almost up for it's a separate episode that I may jump into, but yeah, so that you started seeing that early excitement, for collecting pieces of these stars during that era. And really, this is like the first era where you started actually seeing like full-sized, what we think of as modern cards in soccer. Most of the early releases were on a smaller scale, and they weren't standardized. Some were like these circular discs, what people from the 90s referred to as POG. Some were, the cigarette style, those small skinny cards. Some were square. So there was really no uniformity to the early era, which was similar to other sports like baseball as well. Uniformity in this size of cards really didn't happen until the 50s. And so, in soccer, this really started happening in this around more, either late 50s and 60s, kind of what I'm referring to here as the Pele era. And so, when I was venturing through, I was like, with my familiarity with cards, I was like, what Pele cards are out there? I see all these stickers and things like that. Those are cool. But that was one of the things I looked into. And, like I said, in this era, like one of the first sets I ended up seeing, I started seeing full-size cards was this German release, the Einerlei. Pele has a card. I really like this action shot from it. Some people prefer the more portrait style pictures like the Aquarella. The only thing that kind of bothered me about this one is the fact that they, is a black and white photo that they, like here's, I guess here's a black and white version of a very similar, whether it's the same player or another player from the same game. I'm not sure, but Brazil, this is they were wearing, blue jerseys during this game in the World Cup final against Sweden, but they for some reason chose to colorize the Brazilian jersey as red. But other than that, I really love this card, and to be honest, this is probably other than the Bremer Fachring, this is one of the early, what I'd say was traditional cards that was produced of Pele. In this set too, they had other superstars like Puskás, Yashin, as a number of other, as well as a number of other kind of almost world stars of the kind of the 1958 World Cup, or just in general that era in Europe as far as cards go. And so, in my research, that was really one of the first sets I thought was like, wow, that's really cool. Those look like things that I'm used to as far as cards go. But I would say as I evolved, I realized that the stickers had a lot of the same qualities as you know, as this or the stickers had a lot of same qualities as the cards in terms of visual appeal, and they were kind of more, and also that was kind of what people were used to collecting. Like when you collected albums, it was stickers. Instead of binders, it was sticker albums that you glued into. So it was just kind of during that Pele era. It seemed to the beginning of a mix of kind of the cultures of stickers and cards, and as the era moved on and as Pele's legend went on, it's just, in all these different countries, here's another Einerle release, another one of his early cards, nice portrait with this colorized Santos kit. Again, this was a release out of Italy. I don't even want to pronounce it. A Calciatore set, this was actually in his Santos kit, but again, they made a curious decision to colorize it in his Brazilian colors because of his association. But yeah, actually, it's a Santos kit, which would have been white. Again, more releases from that early era. So there was an appetite even outside of Brazil and worldwide to really portray Pele. This is another sticker from Italy. So you can kind of see that, Italy, really was starting to get interested in producing these cards and stickers of legends during the early 60s. And during the early 60s, that's, I think out of that desire, companies were competing for, attention as far as cards and stickers. And, at that time, a company that ended up enduring started producing their stickers, exclusively in Italy for albums. And if you're at all peripherally aware of the card cycle, you've heard of Panini, which started actually producing stickers for the 1961-62 season under the name Panini Calciatore. And this is an example of one of, in my collection of the early Panini stickers for Eusebio, the Portuguese legend. And I wish I've been looking to collect one of the first set for the 1961-62 to add, just because of the lineage of that set. So, but during that era in the 60s, Panini, started ramping up their production of stickers for albums. And in 1964, Panini, like a lot of the other companies, produced their first Panini Calciatore sticker for Pele. In 60, and here's another one from 60 following year 65. I think these are great looking stickers. Panini really just started developing their aesthetic for these kind of portrait shots that would become kind of their hallmark later on, which I'll discuss. So that was really kind of ended up being one of the turning points, for the soccer collecting space. Other countries, like I said, the Einerle set out of Germany. Germans had an appetite for collecting cards as well that kind of spanned different eras. And some of the early the German teams had some great releases from the Bergman set in the 60s. So a lot of the great stuff from the 60s, from my research, really was centered around that. At least the ones that I liked the most were centered out of Italy and Germany. That being said, Brazil continues to have some great releases for a lot of the iconic Brazilian players, and countries had their own specific releases. Whether it's everyone has heard of, or most people in the soccer market space know of the one of the Johan Cruyff rookies, the Palarex out of Portugal. So as you're researching the era, there are lots of kind of niche releases that you can find from many other countries as well. But it seemed to me like as far as like it really started to catch hold in Italy and Germany at that time in the 60s. especially with full-size cards. So I kind of, in that 1957, 1958 to 19 throughout the 1960s, in my mind, I think of that as the Pele era, as soccer started to be televised, as like the legend and mythology of players like Pele, Cruyff. You had other players like George Best who came up during that era, and who kind of had this almost pop culture crossover where people interacted with that culture through cards. So I guess to uh, tie up kind of the thought process I have of of those eras is that I almost think of soccer card collecting as pre-Pele vintage, and then it has this part where you know, that I'm calling the Pele era, that begins around 1957, going through the 60s, where you know there are some similarities to what I'm used to seeing in the North American collecting culture of cards, and specifically baseball cards, as it became a more of a cultural phenomenon. Um, that obviously that pre-Pele era is a really large era, but I think if you dive into that, you realize that there are just different pockets, and within that you can focus on, whether it's by country or by player, things like that. So, if you're interested in that, like I said, check out the Vintage Discord, or go watch some of um, Al's YouTube videos on Epic Cardboard to really kind of just really understand the scope of diving into those. Um, if learning the history of soccer is something you're interested in, that's almost endless ability to kind of dive back into some of the early just mythology of the players and the countries and just the sport in general. So if that's something that like as a collector you're interested in, like it's hard to do much. It's hard to you can't really replicate that from any of the modern eras. And so I guess, and then probably the biggest turning point of soccer collecting in general, that I think almost anyone who kind of has paid attention to the space would agree is the big turning point, is when soccer sticker or card collecting became larger scale, international, and I think most people would agree that happened with the 1970 Panini World Cup set. It was released in a Italian greenback version, which was distributed in Italy, and then it had the multi-language version on the back that was distributed in countries, mostly across Europe. And so this is the first time that, or first time on a large scale that a company decided to market selling an album, stickers, cards, more so outside of their country. So it really caused an explosion in popularity, and the album and set and things like that were just, I think, captured the minds of people in the UK, as well as other countries around Europe, for the appetite for really putting these albums together. And I didn't grow up in that culture, so I can't really speak to my own personal any nostalgia for it. But I hear lots of collectors who talk about the nostalgia of putting these early albums together. And this set continued for the 1974 World Cup, and when these were produced, like I think they were produced in the multi-language backs, and this really kind of pioneered the aesthetic of that nice beautiful headshots cropped, that was really kind of the aesthetic that was being used for so many of these releases at that time. And then so the 70s were really they released the 1970 World Cup set, the 1974, 78, and so there's been a continuous lineage of Panini for these World Cup sticker albums that continue to this day, which is just such an iconic just lineage for these stickers. And as part of this like kind of global strategy, Panini also started producing Panini stickers that were uh, for specific either leagues in countries outside of Italy. So whether it was the UK, whether it was La Liga, they started expanding just the licenses in all these countries, and um, that really caused the awareness of the Panini brand to just kind of explode, and that really has continued until even the modern even to the modern day for a lot of countries, and that was really instrumental in kind of the popularity of these. For the most part, those were widely produced. Any Panini release from the era, for the most part, you can find a lot of these stickers as opposed to some of the more niche releases that are near impossible to find. But that being said, a lot of the niche Panini releases are even hard to dig out. So I say they're easier to find. I wouldn't say they are easy to find, especially in good condition. Uh, and there are definitely resources out there. I think I actually have a 60th anniversary Panini sticker book that kind of goes through a lot of the lineage of the sets, whether it was, like I said, whether it was the UK stickers or Panini Foot from France or the Panini Este, which was the La Liga releases. You can, depending on what country and players you're, a fan of, or obviously the Panini Calciatore, which focused on, a lot of Italian players, but also included, had, non-Italian players in some of the releases. And so, yeah, and the card, the stickers that, kind of are iconic, like the Panini Calciatore Maradona, was, it's just such an iconic picture of him, early in Argentina in the 1979 or 79-80 album. So I mean that's a way to go. Like if you just like the iconic or just like that visual appeal of those like beautiful headshots from Panini, that's a great starting point for collecting some of these post 1970s vintage era cards. I mean, the other route to go down then is to go after the niche, like country specific releases. And so, as an example, for Maradona, that 1979 is his earliest Panini sticker or card. But really, the more iconic release for me, that is that his like truly his rookie is this niche disc release from Argentina, the 1977 football set. This is from his Argentinos Juniors, early days as like a young teenager, from 1977. Even to this, I think these were widely produced, but there's only maybe 100 of these, even or less total, that have been authenticated and graded. And who knows how many. I mean, there may be more that are still kind of to be found down in Argentina, but like niche releases like that is another way to go in terms of collecting this vintage era, because just discovering sets. So and that's the thing. A lot of people say there are sets and stickers that have yet to even be discovered, and so that is another way to go. So it's two ways to go about it. You can just try to connect all the niche kind of cards from those areas, or you can go after the classic Panini stuff. And so from 1907, so it's in the next era after the Pele era from 1970. I kind of view it as an era in vintage from around 1970 to the early 90s, and you can call that a vintage era. I almost call it the post Panini World Cup era, which is concentrated on stickers again. There were not many cards released over that time, and that era really, I'd say, goes strongly into the 90s as far as collecting goes. And in the 90s, you had kind of just really some of the most iconic early cards and stickers of players like Zidane, Ronaldo. You can collect in all these Panini things, and Panini, like I said, branching out to different countries, They were in Brazil, so Ronaldinho's rookie sticker is again a Panini release. So essentially, the post Panini era really, um, kind of it's really an era unto itself, and that bleeds into the '90s. But I would say around in the early '90s, as Topps really kind of was exploding as far as card collecting in the United States. I think they started branching out a little bit into Europe and specifically the UK, and started producing cards. And then the other card manufacturer that started producing cards that Topps subsequently bought, that everyone's heard of, is Merlin, who they made stickers and cards. And I think the earliest Topps card I found, or set that I know of, and I may, someone can correct me, like if there's an earlier kind of mass-produced, like major, card set from a manufacturer, um, was the 1992, 93 Stadium Club set that was produced for the, um, essentially the Premier League at the advent there. This is, Orion Giggs, what we refer to as probably his rookie card, although he may have an uh, earlier, earlier release of the sticker format. But that was the first. So when I was looking, that was like really the first Topps card I found. And then for the 1994 World Cup, the upper deck set for the World Cup is very famous as far as U.S. collectors go. So in that early '90s, I kind of see that paradigm shift of Panini stickers starting to shift, and manufacturers starting to experiment with cards. And so, the Premier League, the David Beckham rookie card from Merlin from the 95-96 season is a very famous card for any Manchester United or David Beckham collector. And so those Merlin sets starting to be produced in the mid-90s started that paradigm shift from stickers to cards. Although stickers were still being produced and still very popular as album collectors during that era, there was started to be that paradigm shift that was you know started to evolve that into the more modern sensibilities as far as cards go in the modern soccer hobby. And so from that, so then that next era, I think what most people refer to from that early '90s, well, some people, I think it even goes back to the '80s. They refer to the '80s and '90s as the pre-modern era, but I really think the pre-modern era for cards really started in the early '90s. And so that kind of continued through into the early 2000s. The cards that I collect, Topps made a set called, well, actually, it was originally Merlin Premier Gold that started in 1995-96, with that Beckham I mentioned, and it was produced continuously until 2003, 2004. And I think that kind of that era, there was kind of almost a downtick in kind of general interest in cards, kind of this the junk wax era had kind of run its course, and it was becoming harder to sell the cards on a large scale. And Topps did have sets released in '04 and '05 with Premier League players, but really around that time they stopped regularly producing cards. As far as other countries goes, outside of the UK, Merlin in the late '90s produced cards for Italian, for Serie A, but they actually released the cards in Japan, which is interesting. And so a lot of collectors who are interested in certain players who were played in Serie A in the late '90s know of the Merlin sets that were produced, just were produced and then distributed in Japan, partially because it was, those sets in the late 90s were the first sets to have any sort of numbered short print parallel. And so that's, for people who collecting cards and really kind of have, been exposed to the serialized rarity of cards, that was really like the first foray of, of manufacturers into doing short print serialized cards. And then kind of the next, experimental kind of sets for those like, short print serialized cards was actually Upper Deck. And they were trying to capitalize on the global popularity of Manchester United. So in the early 2000s, they produced team sets for Manchester United players only, where they included large numbers of image parallels and started introducing autograph cards into these sets. And autograph cards were pack pulled, were kind of a new concept as well in soccer. There were various, whether it was Merlin sets or a few other sets that did have pack pulled autograph cards, but this was still a very niche kind of concept within the soccer space at that time. So, and so throughout the, like I said, in the 2000s, though, like mid 2000s, there seemed to be kind of just a dead period that started in new soccer card sets. Topps did produce some, sets for, cards during that era, whether it was, Champions League and things like that. But Panini really kind of stepped up their game in the early 2000s as far as producing soccer cards. And they produced their first soccer card set for the World Cup in 2006. And so they've been producing soccer cards for the World Cup since 2006. They also started producing soccer cards in Spain and Portugal, most notably, that people are aware of because of the Cristiano Ronaldo and the Messi rookie cards that come from the Mega Cracks sets. During that time too, the lineage of the stickers continued, and like this is like Messi had a rookie sticker that was produced in 2004, in addition to his probably more famous Mega Cracks rookie card. But again, that kind of going into the the stickers versus cards will be for another discussion. But Panini in the early 2000s really stepped up their game as far as cards go. The other set that was produced in that early era, other manufacturer that really started upping their game on cards during the 2000s was Mundi Chromo, and they, along with Panini, they have continued to produce cards kind of into they started to produce cards into the 2010s. So during that period, again, cards and stickers were kind of very fragmented. I think in 2010-11, Topps, had a random set. So it was really, there was no uniform kind of global kind of sets that were distributed or known. Collectors of, the Premier League or collectors of Spain, they were collecting these sets during this era. At least personally, I was not even aware that, cards were being produced, other things went on in my life, but yeah, it was base cards. There weren't many like numbered, short prints during that era. Autograph cards, while they existed, they were, kind of, sparsely produced, almost impossible to hit or find, hit in a pack or, find even, post after being pulled. There was no real global market. eBay was around, but if you look at old eBay sales, for soccer, they were, it's hard to even find a lot of these cards were, maybe you saw a few of them hit eBay right after release, but after that, it kind of went quiet on them. So, so this era from the early 90s, which, I think in the community, we really refer to that as pre-modern, even though I think people go back into the 80s, as far as pre-modern goes. But I think early 90s, like specifically like 92, that 92 to 94 region is kind of the inflection point where soccer card collecting started having cards by major manufacturers that were produced on a larger scale. And all that backstory. So, these are players that, again, like they were notoriety, whether it was through media, television, that, were really global superstars. And so, really the global appeal of kind of soccer card collecting really started to take a foothold, but it was nowhere near kind of the popularity of American sports. In the 90s, basketball cards started to take off, and because of the junk wax era, when interest started to wane, I think manufacturers got really creative in the late 90s for basketball, baseball, and football, and started producing serialized cards, becoming just a staple of all products in the late 90s, which is kind of what is the hallmark of kind of modern collecting. But soccer, as is kind of alluded to, kind of lags behind what the North American hobby has done. And it really wasn't until 2013 and 14 that Topps and Panini brought soccer card collecting into the mainstream format. And by mainstream format, I mean sets full of numbered, serialized, colored parallels that that are what everyone recognizes now as what manufacturers produce. And from a mainstream standpoint, the first set that a lot of collectors remember being produced and really kind of gaining people's attention was the 2014 Panini World Cup Prism set. It had all of the aesthetic of modern cards mixed with, the nostalgia of kind of the World Cup sets and stickers that Panini had been producing since 1970. So many cards from that set have now become are the most sought after in the hobby. Despite that being kind of the most recognizable as almost the beginning of what we refer to as the modern era of soccer card collecting, the 2013-14 Topps Premier Gold set was really actually predated it. It had now we're used to having tons of parallels, but it only had parallels numbered out of 1 of 1. It had 2 different 1 of 1s, the Premier Gold label, and then the Platinum, and then it had an orange out of 11 and a green out of 99. And that was the parallel scheme for the base cards. It had autograph ones where it had gold and orange as well. But that was the first time. That was really kind of the first time that a major manufacturer had brought the a release to a set that was kind of a whole country rather than just like a team set. Other than going back to Merlin, but it brought the shiny aesthetic. That was another big thing, so that is really that 2013-14 is the inflection point where we find ourselves in the modern era, and kind of like the late 90s for baseball, basketball, and American football. The 2014 to 2018 era in soccer cards kind of mirrors that experimentation where the card companies were going through, like to see what sticks and as far as like design, popularity. And so, they produced, a bunch of sets during that era that, very dependent on where the licenses were. Sometimes they had country licenses, sometimes they had, league licenses. So the sets were kind of haphazard in that way. They were just like, quote unquote soccer release, but they weren't tied to any specific event or country. Select was the brand that they started produce, Panini started producing in 2015. That those had like national team jerseys, and then in 2016 Select they had national team and club specific jerseys, and so that was kind of, whether you're a fan of a player for their club or whether you're a fan of a country, like, you kind of would tailor what you enjoy from those. And so, like, here's an example of the 2016 Select for Wayne Rooney, who I collect. This was in his England country. This one was licensed. If you noticed the Panini Prism one, England was unlicensed, which, I like the set and the player. So, I overlooked the idea, the fact that it wasn't licensed. 2016 Select, or 15 and 16 Select Rooney were both licensed with England. So those are both, great cards if you're a fan of him. I'm more a fan of him for Manchester United, but, I collect him as a player either way. And then also during that era, there were sets that were kind of one-off sets, and they were produced 1 year. They didn't really continue on. A lot of people love collecting them. This is an example of one of those sets, Panini Nobility. This was mostly a set that included, it was either stars or a lot of, post-playing days cards from players who had long since retired. There were other sets like Panini Trouble, which has become pretty popular. Let's see here. And then there's also, I'm trying to think of other ones like Panini Revolution. It was kind of a one-off set, but it continued for the Premier League license in 2020. But and then also during this era, 2015, they started the first other hallmark of modern collecting is, the idea of autographs and patch autograph cards. And so 2015, the first year that soccer really had that product. It was produced by Panini, Flawless, and that's really icon. If you're a fan of any of the players in that set, you're well aware of it. Some of those cards being. I won't dive deep into that set, but there's lots of good stuff to collect in there, including Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo cards. That was really kind of they produced that once, but then there were other bunch of other sets, whether it was Eminence, Immaculate, National Treasures they produced during those eras as well, and so that era really started the patch autograph in the popular consciousness of soccer. And really that experimental era lasted, from 2013-14 to 2014 to 2018 is where I kind of cut it off. Because that's when companies really started producing sets on kind of that really had a lineage that started to continue. And in 2000, so kind of at kind of that inflection point of what I refer to as kind of the golden age. It's the golden age of Panini, and it's, in some ways it's the golden era of soccer collecting. That the inflection point for that, in my mind, is the 2017-2018 Topps Chrome UEFA Champions League set. It's the first year that that really a lineage. It was the first year that Topps Chrome was produced for soccer, for European soccer, and it was released in 2018, and so it really started a lineage where Topps had the license of producing these high-end shiny cards that kind of has continued to the current market. Topps had produced kind of more kind of internet releases of soccer cards for the Champions League. They produced it in I think 15, 16, 16, 17, but those hadn't really didn't grab the foothold. So 2017-18, that's Topps Chrome really kind of, there was the foothold. And part of the reason I think that Topps Chrome developed kind of a foothold and became popular was that it was the first year that Kylian Mbappe's, what was referred to as his rookie card, Again, not really his rookie year per se, but it was kind of his rookie card, and that's where people really kind of, I think that people were chasing him as kind of the next big thing. And it's kind of grown in popularity, partially because the aesthetic of, like, the shininess and the kind of that full bleed on the cards, as well as just kind of it being the first year of kind of high end Topps. And Topps has its lineage all the way back to 1952 with baseball, so something very recognizable that you can kind of collect over time. And like I said, with all these new shiny cards being produced, stickers are still produced, and so some people still, if you really want the Mbappe rookie, it was really this 2016 Panini Foot. But I think in the popular consciousness of most collectors, they started to gravitate toward these new shiny cards, and that inflection point of 2019, became this new era, for what we call, a lot of us collectors call ultra modern, where Topps started producing multiple SKUs. So 2018, 19, they started producing Finest. 2020, they introduced Stadium Club Chrome and Merlin Chrome. And up until this year, they had produced that continuously since 2020. And so they really started building it out. Panini started, releasing, various other sets during this era as well. They started, select for various different licenses. They started Premier League Prism in 2019 that continued until this past year. And so getting into all the licenses and, what cards are produced, those are, separate topics that we'll dive into another time. And so, kind of the first prospect that everyone started, and why I think this is an inflection point, Erling Haaland was one of the first people chased, that, a lot of these sets released in 2020, right as the pandemic hit us. Haaland, for instance, reason kind of this is a whole different era is that he has 3, premium shiny rookie cards from 2019. He's got his rookies from the 2019 Finest. He's got it from 2019 Topps Chrome Bundesliga edition, and he's got his 2019 Topps Chrome Champions League Topps, edition as well. So that's kind of this era where rookies all had rookie cards from multiple different sets. And so that is kind of the dawning of what I refer to as the ultra modern era. And if you're chasing cards, for prospects or for whoever, PC players from that era, you really have to be. It's a little different. It's not quite as simplistic. Like when it was just one set that they came in, like in bygone eras, it's just one set. It was their rookie card. That's their only rookie card. It's a little more straightforward on what you're looking for from their early stuff. But when you get to the modern, ultra modern era, there are more dynamics of which sets you like, or maybe it's the first card from a popular set that's extended, whether it's their first Panini Prism from 2014. That's a first, almost like a rookie, or their first 2017, or their first Topps Chrome, which is 2017-18, like for players, even if they're not rookies or if they're veterans. So the whole dynamic of the modern sets added a different wrinkle into collecting practices. And when you're talking about ultra modern now, where players have are rookies in multiple sets, multiple SKUs, whether it's autograph, patches, you kind of have to pick a lane because it's really hard to collect all of it. So it's a whole new dynamic into the collecting philosophy. All right, so I've kind of gone through the different eras and the big picture of soccer card collecting as far as I see it. Lots in each of those categories, like eras you can dig into to talk about, which I will go into more detail in maybe in future episodes as I kind of go through things that I like to talk about. This is a platform for me to kind of spitball and kind of share and start discussions with collectors. As far as, I did a lot of talking about things that I like to collect in this. I showed some things that I'd like to collect as part of my PC. And so that gives you kind of an idea where my thought process is in collecting. But lots of great collectors out there to follow that have different approaches than I do. No one right way to do it. In terms of like what you like, what speaks to you, I think that's really the way to go. And so, kind of to put a bow on kind of the discussion, really the eras that I kind of break up, you know, soccer collecting to, as far as like personality types, uh, I think the best way to think about it is you go back when you go back to vintage, it is really pre-Pele, pre-television, starting around 1958 and the World Cup. Uh, Anything prior to that, I kind of think of as like a different era that is full of smaller niche things, which is vintage. Like I said, some people refer to that as pre-war, but I think that doesn't really reflect actually what soccer cards looked like. So I think of the soccer card hobby is that you're either drawn to things that like kind of occurred during that pre-Pele era of vintage cards, and I think you can find many lanes with that you can enjoy. And then the next era that I kind of really see a change in kind of the global notoriety of the athletes themselves, as well as card manufacturers trying to capture those, is that Pele era from around 1958 through the late 60s, kind of ending or transitioning in 1970, where Panini, while they had been around since the 1961-62 season, but really 1970 is when what I almost refer to as kind of the Panini World Cup sticker era, began, which kind of changed kind of the wide release structure that Panini principally has, and some other manufacturers had, and that sticker format really dominated from 1970 into the early 90s. And so that inflection point, I don't think there's a hard inflection point for what I will call the pre-modern era, but I think it's really in that early 90s, 92, 94, 95 range, when Topps, Upper Deck, and Merlin produced cards during that early to late 90s run. That's when it kind of, the hobby started to be inclusive of cards and not only stickers. And it was really stickers and cards, depending on how you wanted to collect during that era, as you were collecting at that time. Late 90s started, like I said, Merlin started dabbling in some, numbered cards. Upper Deck with the Manchester United releases started dabbling in numbered cards, autograph cards here and there in the early 2000s. And then the early 2000s also, Panini picked up the mantle of soccer card production, whether it was the World Cup cards produced in 2000, started produced in 2006, as well as the country specific releases, most popularly in Spain, Portugal in the early 2000s, most notable because of Cristiano Ronaldo and Messi. Mundi Cromo, another popular set produced especially for the Spanish league around that time. And that kind of base soccer card predominant era really lasted, was the dominant, kind of format for soccer cards until 2014. And I kind of highlighted that. I think from a popular standpoint, that really started, in terms of visibility with the 2014 Prism World Cup, which started the golden age for Panini, which lasted from 2014 to 18. And I think that golden age for Panini kind of was bookended by the release of the 2017 18 Topps Chrome set, which you can include in that kind of golden era, or you can say it's kind of the start of the kind of the modern era of Topps as far as being a soccer manufacturer. And so I think, so then starting in 2019, that 2014 to 19 era is kind of that golden age of modern collecting. And so after 2019, I guess you can still call it modern collecting, but it's almost changed into what we call the ultra modern format, where there are multiple releases across manufacturers, across multiple licenses and things like that. So from 2019 on, it has evolved, but it has pretty much a similar format. So that's just the rundown of the different eras that, as far as the soccer card hobby, you can look into. Hopefully, if you haven't gone deep into it, this is kind of how I've come to think of things over my 5 years of essentially exclusively collecting soccer cards. And I will visit with hopefully another episode soon, and be curious and keep collecting.